Viewers to another one of our live episodes of Huda Tonight, and I'm your host for the evening, Junaid Dar. Brothers and sisters, we have two very different segments prepared for you today. In segment number 2, we're going to be looking at the crisis that's taking place in Syria at the moment. And in segment number 3, we're going to be talking about the importance for a Muslim to speak the truth, for him to stand upright and to speak the truth, be that in matters of ease or in matters of difficulty. Now, coming back to segment number 2, dear brothers and sisters, it doesn't need any introduction. We all know what is taking place in Syria at this moment in time. In 2011, we saw violence break out in Syria, which led to a major civil war. And it's reported by the UN that up to 250,000 people have died between the clashes by Bashar al-Assad's regime and the rebels. Furthermore, the UN Refugee Agency has reported that up to 4 million people have fled Syria, and half of those are children. Now, when we look at the news outlets, when we look at social media, we see these images of Syrian families jumping into boats, trying to flee across the seas and trying to find a safer place, be that in Europe or be that in other places. And one image that really strikes the mind, which sits in our minds and shakes our hearts, is that very famous picture of that young Syrian boy that was lying face down in the red t-shirt on one of the beaches in Europe. Brothers and sisters, the situation in Syria is very dire, and we need to understand this from a number of different perspectives. So let us begin by introducing our guest, and then we'll go straight into this very broad and very deep subject. With me today, we have with us a very special guest. We have with us Dr. Imad Muhanna, who is a professor of political science and strategic studies. It gives me great pleasure, Doctor, to have you on the program. And I'd like to begin by saying Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Doctor, when I was informed that you was coming to the program and we had the topic of Syria, I was very excited, and I've seen your work, and I'm very happy to meet you here today.
So appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Let us begin from the top and have a look at the events that took place in 2011. Can I ask you to give us some of the background or the reasons to why violence broke out in 2011? And furthermore, are these events connected to what was going on in other Arab countries, be that in Tunisia, be that in Yemen at this time, please?
Absolutely. The way the Arab countries were ruled over the past 30 to 40 years were very, very autocratic style. A lot of oppression, no freedom of speech, a lot of victimization and marginalization to a lot of groups, particularly when it comes to some groups, whether they are religious or ethnic or even tribal. I think the situation in Syria that erupted in 2011, particularly in March, very similar to what happened in Egypt, Khalid Said, and what happened in Tunisia as well.
Okay.
Basically, it was a group of kids that were arrested by the security forces, and I think it was again the same concept that was, or approach that was followed in Tunisia and in Egypt. Peaceful demonstration asking for these kids to be released. And in the beginning, to start with, the demonstration were very peaceful in the beginning, but again, the style of autocratic and security-based states were not very happy with that, so they opened fire on people, and that demonstration, a lot of people actually died.
Okay.
From that point, I think escalated the same way that we've seen in Tunisia and Egypt, and other parts started to escalate. But unfortunately, it became more and more complicated by the day due to the fact that it no longer became a group of kids that were arrested. It became an ethnic conflict between Shia and Sunnis, and political conflict between the different groups having the opposition parties, for example, against Bashar al-Assad. So it took a different dimensions, and it became very, very complicated. And I've seen at this point it involved superpowers as well, and it became more than a civil war, getting into a Cold War itself.
Okay, before we go into the superpowers, Doctor, wasn't there a period from, like I mentioned, 2000, wasn't there a period where there was peaceful protests taking place up and down the country before violence erupted? Wasn't that a
Absolutely, absolutely. It was a few months, but again, every now and then, I think the style of the way Bashar al-Assad used, and the same thing that happened with Mubarak, they don't accept at all the demonstration, whether it's peaceful or based on a fight. So they never really accepted the fact that people need a change. And I think what happened in Syria, very similar to what happened in Egypt and in Libya and Tunisia. People need a change. And if rulers and governors do not accept the fact that the world changes, it's never going to change. We've seen that change in France. We've seen that change even in a civil war in the United States in the 80s and 90s when the cases happened in Los Angeles with the African Americans. So the world changes, and therefore rulers of the Middle East, I think, will need to change and keep up that change.
So would it be fair to say that the people in Syria especially, that they were pushed into a corner?
Absolutely, they were pushed into that. Absolutely, because let's agree that pressure really that was put on the people was basically too hard to accept. A lot of people died, and reaching, as we've seen, 250,000.
Yeah,
so we've reached a point really with no return. So with time, a lot of people are grieving basically because of their kids or because of their husbands. A lot of people are basically, or women became widows, orphans. So it really got out of hand. And I think Bashar al-Assad managed it very badly in the beginning. I think every now and then you have to let people just kind of burst to basically express themselves. And this is really the change of the 21st century, the people, or the 20th century and 21st century, that information has become exchanged easily. So whatever you really withheld from people through the state media, they will know it from social media. So I think ruling countries have changed over the past 20 to 30 years. People have become more aware of the political facts, and they need to change. They need more freedom, and they need absolutely freedom of speech.
Excellent, fantastic. Doctor, also you mentioned the rise of the violence in 2011, and it started off with some youngsters, but then eventually we see the formation of parties and groups. So can I ask you to talk about some of the initial parties that evolved out of this process?
Unfortunately, it's very hard to say which specific groups are really driving the violence at this point, but it's estimated that over 1,000 groups are actually party to this, and they're all against Bashar al-Assad. Most important one that is really featuring on the scene since the beginning of 2014 was the ISIS, or IS, the Islamic State. And they are a group of Islamic extremists that basically had that, the dawn of their era in Iraq, started to occupy large parts of lands and basically victimizing people on some parts and forcing people to follow them, and taken by force a number of states and villages, as we've seen throughout the region. But what we've also seen is a number of political parties, a number of political refugees that are in exile, and they can't return to Syria. So basically what you have in there is a variety of groups that are involved and driving the conflict, whether they are political parties, political refugees that are Syrian political refugees in other countries. You find the IS groups. You find basically some countries are supporting, and this is very important, supporting the military actions. We've seen a lot of weapons. At some point, United States dropped the weapons, and they said they dropped it by mistake to the IS, so they already have weapons. And you're talking about more than 100,000 at the least estimation of these groups. So it's a large number, and I think that the Syrian organized army is not more than that in number. So it's just different in weapons. In addition to that, you got a lot of support, particularly come from Turkey, coming from Iran, coming from other parts of the world, that countries that are trying to drive the conflict and break the national security of the Arab region.
Okay. And Doctor, before we talk about the external powers and external hands that are involved in this war, can I also ask you to tell us about the relationship between the war in Iraq and then the war in Syria? Because I feel there is a connection here, there is some kind of a link.
Absolutely. The fact here is we've got a problem with the Shia approach in the Middle East, the same problem that is in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia. We've seen what happened in Syria, an objection of Iranian. I think here there is a mix between the country as an independent state and ideologies. And what happened basically, if you look at the situation in Iran, where they objected to the death penalty of the Saudi citizen because of Shia, it's got nothing to do with you because he's a Saudi citizen. Okay. So here, some of the parties or the countries are mixing between the ideologies or religious ideologies and the nationality or the citizenship or the jurisdiction of the state in that area, and mixing papers. And therefore you find that a lot of parties like Iran and Turkey are supporting some of the Daesh because they are attacking the Sunnis particularly. So it's basically the fourth and fifth generation of wars where you basically play or you get involved in a war on behalf of somebody who's probably having a nice holiday in the Caribbean. And this is exactly what is happening in the Middle East.
Okay, I just would like to stop you there. Dear viewers, would like to remind you of two things. Firstly, our phone lines are open, so please do give us your questions or your comments. We have the professor here in the studio, and he will take your questions here live or on air. And secondly, we have just put up a picture on our Facebook page on Huda Tonight relating to the subject of Syria. And we would like for you to put your comments. It's on the screen, you can see the images there. We would like for you to put your comments or your thoughts or your questions under this picture, and then we will address those to the professor here in the studio. So please do get involved on Facebook and do get involved on the phone. And I'm here watching the Facebook page, so please give us your questions or your queries.
In terms of your questions, just going back to that particular point, the similarity between the situation in Iraq and the situation in Syria, you find that always the Iranian fingers are playing in there. Iran has always been the enemy of Iraq and vice versa. And I think Iran has supported the rebels in Iraq to try to break the country. Number one, strategically, because it makes Iraq a lot weaker on the border, so Iran is having a free ride in the region. Secondly, you find that Iran was faced by Iraq when it comes to the Arab national security, because the first shield to the Arab national security was Iraq against Iran. But now with the collapse of Iraq, you can find that now they are interfering with Saudi Arabia, they're interfering with Emirates, interfering with Kuwait, and they're having now their hands also in the politics of Egypt. So the situations are very similar. The similarity here is in one point that Iran is playing a role to break down the entire Middle East into pieces, participating in the new Middle East plan that was proposed by the Western societies to basically break down the entire Middle East from 56 countries to 88 based on ethnic differences, and therefore it becomes Iran becomes the superpower in the region. And I think this is really what they're praying, and the proof for that is the peaceful agreement between Iran and a 5+1 on a nuclear program of Iran. So it's very clear that Iran is playing the role of the devil here on behalf of the Western society or the colonizing countries that want to get their hands on the resources in the Middle East.
So is it fair then to say, as you've just mentioned, that Iran is simply executing the plans of the West and the plans of those who want to see the splitting and the destruction of the Middle East?
Absolutely, because it's a fourth and fifth generation war. It's basically by proxy. You don't really fight the war directly, and this is basically what they're doing. In the beginning, or 50, 60, 100 years ago, we used to see the military conflict or confrontation is the first step when a country wants to get their hands on the resources of other countries. We've seen that the colonization of Egypt and a number of other countries. But now the military confrontation became lost. Number one, they play on 5 main dimensions to basically weaken the countries. Number one is to fiddle with the management of the country, put corrupted people in the system, having people betray their own country against money, having the health system destroyed, having the education destroyed, having the culture destroyed. When you look at the 3 factors, education, culture, health, on top of that, the management of the country, it becomes with the 4 factors here, military confrontation becomes very easy. And this is what basically happened when America attacked Iraq. They were already preparing years before they got into the military confrontation, so it became very easy. The same thing they're trying to allow or do. If you look at the situation in Egypt, comparing to that, you find that they're already putting their hands in a lot of areas like health, education, culture, destroying the culture of the Egyptians. And the plan was to have a military confrontation in 2011 through the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood, the Americans knew they will never be able to run the country, but they needed them for one purpose, which basically have that confrontation with the military, which was described quite clearly by Condoleezza Rice, the destruction from within. So they create enemies from the state, and it becomes a civil war.
Okay, excellent. A lot of people had a lot of hope in what they call the Arab League, which is a collection of Arab leaders or Arab diplomats. Do we still have hope in them?
Absolutely. Let me just take people back in history, because what I'm going to say, probably a lot of people don't know, and it might actually disturb them, that the Constitution and the Declaration of the Arab League was written by Eden, the Prime Minister of England. It was never written by the Arabs. The Arab League was never established by the Arabs. The Arab League was established by the British. And the reason here that you want to do that is catch the Arab before they do their own unity, is we do it for you. So it's basically, I'm worried that you're going to have a unity with your friends and colleagues, so I'll say, well, I'm going to establish that unity for you. So I start writing the declaration, start writing the conditions of membership, and then put it forward. So you come and say, well, it's a very great idea, thank you very much. But what you actually didn't notice, that I put the declaration that suits me. So let's give an example so people can see how it's working. If you look at the voting inside the Arab League, it's actually not binding. The voting inside the Arab League is not binding. For example, if we've got 23 countries, 15 of them vote yes on attack in Syria, for example, and the other people, the minorities, say no. Then it becomes binding for the 15 people that said yes, but not binding for the other, because it's not a majority vote. So the voting system that's in the Arab League doesn't allow that. If you look at the second approach, which was initiated by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the establishment of the United Army, the constitution of the Arab League does not allow that. So how did the Arabs get, or Saudi Arabia with Egypt and other 7 countries, through a clause in the United Nations Declaration, which is a self-defense. So self-defense was the basis for creating the Arab Army in Yemen, but not the Arab League. So here I'm tying between how the United Nations work and how the Arab League works. The Arab League does not allow for a joint army, but the United Nations allow, but under one condition, it's for self-defense. So let's hypothetically agree that there is no danger on Saudi Arabia. Then Saudi Arabia cannot stand and say we're going to have a joint army. You've got no ground.
Right.
Because there's no self-defense. So, but if we're Arab League, then we can have a joint army. So what is it that I'm proposing? Is we need to reform the Arab League, starting with the management of the Arab League, how it's structured, how the Security the Council is established, how the National Assembly is established, how the declaration basically allows for voting. It becomes binding by majority. And from that on, I think we will be able to have a stronger body. We are 23, 24 countries, but we control more than 40% of natural resources in the world. And we've seen Emirates now trying to celebrate the last barrel that goes out of oil. So what we're trying to do here is understand what we have. We are great power, that we basically control over half the reserve of the world in terms of financial reserve. And let me tell you that 2 countries can actually make the entire United States economy collapse in 24 hours. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. If they change their reserve from dollars to euro, or to have a parallel Arab currency like dinar, for example, and it can be exchanged, I think, like the euro, for example. And this is the second plan. So for the solution, number 1 is to reform the Arab League, having a proper political structure for the Arab League. Number 2, to take serious steps towards the Arab joint venture. And we've seen in January 2015 the establishment of the free trade zone between the Arabs, but still on customs and tariffs. But from that, I think we can have the European Union. And in some of the studies, and these studies are on President Sisi's desk, and I was honored to be part of these studies, is that we can have the Arab Union basically beating the European Union in less than 4 years.
Really?
In terms of economy, in terms of reserve, in terms of national the food security, in terms of defense. If you look at the amount of aircrafts, for example, that are in different countries in Saudi or Syria and Egypt, you can have the third army in the world. So the fact here is we have what we need. All we need is the political desire to unite.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Also, dear viewers, just give you a gentle reminder again to go to our Facebook page, Huda Tonight, and you will see the image there of the events taking place in Syria. Please leave your comments under that picture there, and we will address your comments or questions to the doctor, and we can bring out some of your points as well. Doctor, I would like to ask you also about the role of two of the world's major superpowers, and that's of America and Russia. Many of us who are not in tune with the political science of what is going on are confused with what do these two countries want and what are they doing?
Let's first all agree that politics is the tool of benefits.
Okay.
So if you have benefits, you will play politics. If you don't have benefits, you will ignore it. So the fact here is you find that countries always get involved in areas where there's benefit. There is famine in Africa. Nobody got involved. A lot of countries in Africa have civil war. Nobody cared. But they cared when Iraq attacked Kuwait because there is resources. They care when there is conflict in Syria because there is the national security of Israel. They care when there is a problem in Libya because they want to get into Egypt. So they always get involved because it serves part of the plan. So that basically makes us understand quite clearly that politics is not the priest's game. It's basically, it's the devil's game. That we basically try to use whatever resources we have to achieve whatever we desire.
Okay.
So if you look at the situation of Russia, and right in the beginning, they left it right through, talking probably about now 4 years down the line, never got involved. They just behind the scenes supporting Bashar al-Assad. But when they got involved, when they found that the Western society led by the United States is trying to get in. Now here it's very important to understand the importance of the Middle East in the region. The Middle East, whether people like it, it's the heart of the world.
Right.
It's 40% of resources are in this particular area. The money is in this particular area. The warm waters and the center of the world. And let me tell you that when it comes to the actual national security of any superpower, it's lying in the Middle East. If you look at Suez Canal right in the center, or Sinai right in the center, you've got West Gibraltar, or Jabal Tariq, and you've got the east, you've got Hormuz, you've got Bab el-Mandab in Yemen, and you've got Cape Gudub in South Africa.
Okay.
So if you look at that, the center that you have in Sinai, or the Suez Canal, which basically close to Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the south of Europe, that's basically the center of all gates into the Middle East.
Right.
So if you have superpowers, and this is part of the plan that we have in a second crossing, national mega plan of Egypt, is to have, with the unity of the Arabs, you can have basically the aircraft carriers, that's our dream, sailing through the different seas. In the Middle East, we're blocking the Jabal Tariq, or the mountain of Tariq, we're blocking the Bab el-Mandab, we're blocking Hormuz, so we can basically close and open on our command who enters the Middle East. And this basically means that the warm waters of the Middle East, or the hot lands of the Arabs, are basically the attraction of all superpowers, not just politically, but number one, for the national security of Israel, because they want to secure Israel. Number two, they want to get into the resources that are there in the Middle East. And number three, that if you look at even the human resource development in Europe, it's an aging society. Okay. So it is, in terms of development and civilization, they're getting slower and slower. And the future is for us, the Arabs. And that's why they know if you are freed, you have a lot to do, and you're going to control the world. That's why they always just push in these conspiracies into the Middle East. And they playing on now the competitive advantage of the Arab, which is youth. If you look at the youth in the Middle East, you're talking about more than 60% of population.
Okay.
Talking over 500 million Arabs, 60% of them are youth. And that basically worries them. If you look at Europe or United States, you're talking about 20 to 30%. So we are in a very advantaged position in terms of resources, in terms of human resource, in terms of money. And this is basically what you need to build a strong nation: land, labor, and capital.
Excellent.
And we have the three of them. And therefore, they are quite worried to basically give us the freedom to do whatever we desire.
And hence they're working very hard to make sure that
Absolutely.
we don't get to those
Absolutely.
resources.
And they play different roles.
Of course.
So if they can't do it directly through the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, with the connection of the United States, they'll do it through Iran. So give Iran a peaceful time through the agreement on the nuclear program 5+1, and then remove the economic sanction on them, but on a condition that you're going to play on our behalf.
Right.
So they start supporting Houthis in Yemen against Saudi Arabia to break that southern barrier border, having supported Daesh in different areas in Syria, in western Egypt, to try to invade and violate the Arab national security. So the Arabs will have to wake up very much very soon.
Okay. That drives me to my other question. So we've talked about the role of Russia, we talked about the role of the States, we also talked about the role of Iran and trying to play a superpower. But what about other groups like Hezbollah or other smaller factions? I mean, are they involved in the fight? And
absolutely,
what are they doing?
Again, because it's a narrow ideology that drives them. We've got to, as Arabs, we've got to understand that we have to live religion aside, or leave religion aside, because once you get into religion, you're going to have a lot of conflict. For example, if you're going to talk about Sunnis and you've got the 4 imams, then we might have 4 groups fighting each other.
Okay.
And then you've got the Sunnis against the Shia. And then in the Shia, you might find different groups. So I think the approach that Iran is playing, and again, the super hand here is Iran, supporting Hezbollah, against basically what is happening in Syria in support of Bashar al-Assad. So again, it's because the majority of the leaders in Syria are Alawis. So you're talking about a very much Shia approach. So the fact here is very much ideological conflict.
So there is a common denominator amongst
absolutely. The common denominator here is the ideological approach that is, or agenda, let's call it, looking at Iran trying to basically achieve the old empire of Persia, and basically using different spots, having Hezbollah in some areas, Daesh in certain areas, Houthis in other areas. So you find they invading all different parts in the Arab world. And I think the Arabs, let me say that fighting terrorism or fighting military groups is not the only solution. We have to work on a political and a cultural agenda to create awareness, explain to people what's happening. And I thank really, allow me to thank Al Huda channel for explaining that, because it's very important, because you can kill me if I have a different ideology with you, but it's easier if you make me understand, then I'll be in your support. So I think what the Arabs need, the Arab leaders need at this point, is to explain to people what is it that is going on around them, what is it the conspiracy that the Arabs are facing. These conspiracies go back to 1907, when they had the meeting in London around the new Middle East. And we've seen a lot of development starting quite clearly in the light. In 1954, we've seen the assassination of President Nasser. We've seen the assassination of Rahmatullah Ali, King Faisal. We've seen the assassination of Sadat. And from that on, they're playing on different approaches to basically invade the Middle East and control all resources.
Okay, Doctor, we have a number of comments and questions coming through to us via the internet, so I'm going to address you with some of those. The first one comes from Abdullah Abil, who says, where are the human rights organizations? And then he writes, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. So where are these human organizations?
I'm sorry. The human rights organization, we have to understand that the human rights organizations also serve political agendas. And let me give you some examples. If you look at the court cases where a lot of Arab leaders were sentenced, where are the human rights? So the fact here is, human rights is one of the tools. And we're not saying that there is no human rights. There is human rights. But unfortunately, when it comes from the superpowers, they always turn a blind eye when it comes to the Arab human rights. But when it comes to cases like in France or in Yugoslavia, they stand up. So it's a double standard. And this is what we need to understand. And I'll give to Brother Abdullah the same approach if we apply democracy. What is democracy? So are they applying the democracy in their own land? It's absolutely not true. In Hurricane Katrina, when the south of the United States was flooded, George Bush visited the region 6 days later.
Right.
Why? Because they're blacks. So the fact here is, they playing on double standard. They saying, you know, the Arabs, you have victimized human rights, but in their own lands, there is no human rights whatsoever. So all we're saying, it is a tool.
Okay.
It's definitely a great thing, but it's used as a tool, a political tool.
Doctor, I'm going to push you for answers a bit faster because we're short of time and we have a few people who've made some comments. The comments that people have put forward will be put on the screen, so all of your comments will be shared on air, as you can see now. We also have Abdul Karim, who makes a comment or makes a dua, a prayer. Oh Allah, please grant peace to my Muslim brothers and sisters in Syria. So we can see that the people are very concerned about the affairs there. And our third comment comes from Yusuf Salihin, and he writes, we ask Allah to protect people of Syria. We must do our best to support them. Allah will hold us accountable and ask us about them.
Yeah.
Oh Allah, shower them with your mercy. So
this is very important point, and here the responsibility lies not just on the rulers of the Arab world, but also on the nations. Whatever we do, whatever we can do, we have to do. But I think the responsibility starts from the Arab leaders, basically to reform the Arab League politically and then economically, and from that we're going to have a lot of resources to support our brothers. And let me tell you that the world respects the powerful, not the polite. The world respects the powerful. And if we are powerful, the world will fear us. And this is what we need to do. Islam is a great religion, but it needs a sword. And a sword that is based on wisdom and justice. So we have to get basically our papers right to become a powerful nation that basically protects our own rights.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Doctor. I'm privileged to have you on the show, and inshallah we can have you again next week and we can take this topic of Syria even further, because I think there's lots to discuss. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, we've come to the end of segment number 2 here on Huda Tonight, and we began this journey by looking at the crisis in Syria, and as the doctor explained and even gave some solutions on what we need to do and how we need to move forward. It's possible. It's all possible, but it depends on how we see it and what we are going to do about it. So I'd like to thank those who contributed through our Facebook page, be that Abdullah, be that Abdul Karim, and also Yusuf Salihin. Thank you very much for your questions and also your du'as. And the Prophet ﷺ, he did say that the Muslims are like one body. If any part of that body is feeling pain, then the rest of the body is also feeling pain, and we are all paining for Syria. Dear brothers and sisters, please do remember them in your du'as. We're going to take a very short break, and when we come back, we'll join you in segment number 3. So just a few moments. Assalamu alaikum.